on this edition of Native Report. We watch master quilt maker Gwen Westerman construct a beautiful star quilt. We learn about Mni Sota Makoce, the land of the Dakota.
For the beautiful people of the Red Lake celebration.
And we take a look back at our very first story from Season 1 of Native Report. We also learn something new about Indian country and hear from our elders on this Native Report.
Production of Native Report is made possible by grants from the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux Community and the Blandin Foundation.
Welcome to the premiere episode of our 10th season of Native Report. I'm Stacey Thunder. The star quilts of Gwen Westerman are grounded in Dakota culture and history. The women in her family have made functional quilts for 6 generations. Another function her quilts serve is that they each tell a story.
I see myself as an artist, which took me a while because I didn't think that I had earned that title, but I'm growing more comfortable with it now, because to be inspired by a story or a person or a landscape and to translate that into an image that other people can respond to is an act of artistry.
Working in the solitude of her basement workshop, Gwen Westerman pieces together a star quilt, a craft she learned from the women in her family. The quilt will eventually be gifted to a person recognizing a personal achievement in their life.
Quilts have been a part of our family life for as long as I can remember. And when I moved to Minnesota, I had some of my grandma's quilts, and somebody came to the house and said, "Why is that on the bed? It should be hanging on the wall." I thought, well, who on earth would hang a quilt on the wall? You're supposed to use it. And it was a little while after that, about 15 years ago, that I started quilting and have done traditional patterns that my grandma used, and then started making star quilts and have adapted that 8-point star to an art quilt format. We think of a star quilt now as something very traditional, and it comes from a traditional place, but we weren't quilters from the beginning. The star, a 4-point or 5-point star, has been part of our artwork from the time we were making petroglyphs, painting hides, and then in quill work and beadwork. And for us as Dakota people, that morning star signals the beginning of a new day, and that we should always be thankful that we can see another day. And when the missionaries showed up and taught our people how to sew, they also taught them how to quilt. And that pattern, the 8-point star, has been adapted now and has become part of our culture. The star quilt has become a gift of honor for a lot of Native people, and we make them for our family members, for people who have accomplished significant things in their lives.
Quilting is a very labor-intensive art form. A single quilt may take 1 or 2 years, sometimes more, to finish, and it's rare that one may come together in a matter of days. Still, Gwen finds the whole process gratifying.
This is called We Come From the Stars, and in Dakota that is Wichonk Vihechia, Tahan Uhipi. We come from the stars. And it has very traditional colors: red, yellow, blue, white, black, and then some brass bells and a mirror in the center with beadwork around it. And I like to think that people, when they walk up and see this quilt, they can see themselves in that mirror. I had it on my wall, hanging on my wall for a long time because I just wasn't quite sure what to do with it. And then I figured it out probably a year later. So that quilt took me about 4 years to finish. This one is called Ina, for my mother, and it's got multiple layers of meaning here. And obviously the first one is the turtle, and the earth is our mother. My grandmother made this traditional pattern. It's called a drunkard's path, which is a terrible name, but it involves some curved edges, and I worked that pattern into these turtle shapes. And my mother's father's family, they all have water animal names. So my grandpa's name was Yaskanahi, which means hard-shell turtle. And my mom collected turtles, and so I made this for her when she got sick and had to go on dialysis, because I thought, well, this will be good. She can take it with her to dialysis. But she died before I finished it. But I really like the turtles for my mother.
Gwen, a professor of English and Humanities at Minnesota State University, Mankato, and a published author, has won numerous awards for her quilts, some of which are in permanent collections, such as the Red Cloud Heritage Center in Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and the Minnesota Historical Society.
My grandmother would have never considered herself an artist. She would say, I'm just an old woman making a quilt for somebody I love. And I think that it's taken off the way it has for me because the stories that are important to us as Dakota people, as Native people in general, are often incorporated into the quilts that I make. Oh, I definitely feel a connection to the past, to the people who came before me, to the stories that shape who we are. And I'm often singing traditional songs to myself when I work, in addition to listening to other kinds of music. And often there's an element of prayer there, depending on what I'm making. We all have stories to tell about who we are and where we came from. And even if we weren't listening directly when our grandparents were sitting around talking, or when our parents were visiting with family members or friends, I think those stories sink in when we hear them, almost subconsciously. We have to sit still sometimes and just listen.
Did you know that Mni Sota Makoce, The Land of the Dakota, by Gwen Westerman and Bruce White, won both the 2013 Minnesota Book Award in the category of history, as well as the 2014 Hognander Minnesota History Award that recognizes the most outstanding scholarly work related to Minnesota history. Over the years, a great deal of the focus on the Dakota people in Minnesota tells the tragic events of the 1862 U.S.-Dakota War and the resulting exile that sent the majority of the Dakota to prisons and reservations beyond the state's boundaries. The publisher of the book notes that the true depth of the devastation of the removal cannot be understood without a closer examination of the history of the Dakota people and their deep cultural connection to the land that is Minnesota. Westerman and White drew upon oral history interviews, archival work, and comparisons of Dakota, French, and English sources. Mni Sota Makoce tells the detailed history of the Dakota people in their traditional homelands for hundreds of years prior to their exile.
Next, the Dakota phrase Mni Sota Makoce, land where the waters reflect the clouds, gives the state of Minnesota its name. It is also the title of a book authored by Bruce White and Gwen Westerman that closely examines Dakota history and their cultural connection to the land.
Mni Sota Makoce by Dr. Bruce White and Dr. Gwen Westerman is an award-winning book on Minnesota history. Dr. White recently visited the Native Report studio, where I had the opportunity to interview him. This book was a collaborative effort. Could you tell us how the book came about in the first place?
In 2007, a group of Dakota people came to me and asked me if I would help them work on a project to study the history of Dakota people in Minnesota and their relationship to the land. And many Dakota people are somewhat frustrated by the fact that there's not a lot of understanding that Minnesota is really a Dakota place. We got a grant, we gathered people together to work on it, including my co-author Gwen Westerman, who's a professor at Mankato State University, and we worked for several years gathering information, and then in 2010 we got a grant from the Minnesota Historical Society to write the book.
We had a team that scoured the archives for maps, journals, historical documents. My team was responsible for oral history interviews, and we interviewed Dakota people from practically every reserve in Canada and all of the Dakota reservations in Minnesota and Nebraska, North, South Dakota, and Montana. I think what's more important about Mni Sota Makoce is that it's from a Dakota perspective.
It's been a long process, but all of the people that we've worked with have continued working with us, and the book came out in 2012.
And you said that you found a treaty that was written in the Dakota language, and you had it retranslated. And so, what was that process, and what did you find out after you retranslated it?
That's one of the most famous treaties is the Treaty of 1851, which was the treaty that's said to have, essentially transferred ownership to the land of the entire southern Minnesota region. The point of this chapter is that Dakota people had a very particular meaning to their understanding of the land, that land was a relative in a sense. So to try to understand how they could sign a treaty that would give away their connection to the land is important, to try to understand that. So I think Gwen was looking in some source and found that there was a Dakota language version of the 1851 treaty translated by one of the missionaries for the purpose of then presenting that to the Dakota, because the treaty was written in English. I was amazed to see that there were whole sections that had not even been translated. So what does it mean in Dakota to say, you're selling the land to the federal government? How do you even translate that? So they had to pick a term in English that could somehow convey that. They said, to throw away the land. And, that's mind-boggling, because it's so contrary to the way that Dakota or any other native people of that region would have viewed the idea of, how can you throw away a relative if the land is your relative? I think ultimately you have to despair and say, there really wasn't a way to translate this. And perfect understanding was not possible for the Dakota people. And it's rare, I think, to find a treaty in the language of the people who signed it, because that was not done routinely. And you might see in a treaty negotiation where somebody says, well, it was explained to them, but then you would not know how it was explained to them.
And you also rediscovered some very old maps. And what was the significance of some of the French maps and others?
One of the most interesting maps I recall is the map of Jean-Baptiste Franquelin, who was a French map maker of the 17th century. And one of the sites in particular that's really interesting is Mille Lacs Lake. They did know that it was a Dakota place, and it was called Bede-Wakan, which means sacred lake, mysterious lake. And the first, or one of the important bands of the Dakota is the Bede-Wakan, meaning the people of the sacred lake. And they were people that, when the French first came, they were living on the shores of what is now known as Mille Lacs.
I'm a typical Minnesotan. Why do I want to read this book?
My hope is that you, like many people, would read the book. I mean, I say that many people because people have told me this, that some people read the book and they say they had no idea. They had no idea first that Minnesota is a Dakota place, Dakota people named it. They had no idea of this whole and thing. Somebody at the Historical Society said to me, I feel like I have to walk more carefully now on this land because it's not my land. And I would hope that people would have that sense of understanding after reading the book.
Thank you so much, Dr. White.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
I started dancing when I was 3 years old, and today I'm 80. I love to dance. I come to all the powwows in Minnesota, Morton, Mankato, you know. And not only that, I go all over in South Dakota, North Dakota, wherever there's a powwow, I'm there, because I love powwows. And when I was growing up, my mother told me I had to do the lulu, and I said, I don't know how. And she said, that's from your ancestors, my great-grandma on up, she said. So I had to learn to do the lulu. So I go sing behind a drum and I can sing, do the lulu. And I love Mankato powwow. This year I met some new friends. Yeah, every time I go, I meet new friends. Then I see my old friends again. Yeah, so I just love Minnesota. And then I'm in that educational program. And they said, gee, you've been here for a long time. I said, I must because I'm 80.
In upcoming episodes, we will celebrate our 10th season by looking at the places we've been and the people we've met through stories as they originally aired. I'm pleased to present from the Native Report archives our very first story from Season 1, Episode 1, the Red Lake Independence Day Powwow.
Hey boys, a beautiful song for a beautiful day. What a beautiful people of the Red Lake celebration. Hoka hey, Gwen and tea time. Ooh yeah, hook hook, hookah.
The Red Lake Nation Independence Day celebration, which is taking place right now. We are celebrating the commemoration of the 1889 agreement between the federal government and Red Lake Band of Chippewa Indians, which was an agreement. It's not a treaty, it's an agreement that was negotiated right here, you know, about a mile down the edge of the cliff here over at Pike Creek. They met for I think close to 10 days, 7 to 10 days, talking and negotiating this agreement. And that agreement was the federal government and the representatives from the state of Minnesota, the religious people, they all came here. They wanted to persuade our chiefs back then to adhere to to agree with what they call a General Allotment Act, Dawes Act, the Nelson Act, whatever they want to call it.
The Dawes Act came about in 1887, and 2 years after that, it came to the state of Minnesota, and it was known here in Minnesota as an Act for the Relief and Civilization of the Minnesota Chippewa. The purpose of the Allotment Act was to place us on individual land, to go by the foreigner's belief that you need to own the land and you need to just live on one territory and you need to then pay the taxes on that territory. But Red Lake is unique in the fact that our people didn't believe that the land could be owned, so to speak. That's a foreign concept. And we still hold true to that tradition of all Indian people in the view of the land at the time of contact, that the land is our mother and cannot be owned or have a title to it. It meant to make us individual farmers. And that is a misconstrued concept about making Indian farmers, because we always lived off the land. We couldn't have survived this many years if we didn't know how to live off the land. It meant to break up Indian land and give so many acres, like 160 acres to each head of household, and then from there it broke down to like 80 acres for, individual people. But eventually they started losing the land because of the Allotment Act.
Who negotiated for Red Lake?
I think it was a habit of the United States government to try to condense our leaders into a smaller group and say, well, you'll be a chief, you'll be a chief, you'll be a chief. I believe that we had headmen for each clan, and so it was easier for them to deal with just a few people rather than the clan themselves. So the clans, the headmen would bring like 15 or 30 people, but the United States government chose to just deal with the headmen.
The chiefs never decided by themselves. No one person didn't say, yes, we will do it. It took the head chief would back off and go talk with, he'd have everybody with him, but yet they'd still go and discuss it further in detail. The Allotment Act and all the chiefs that existed back then, they would not agree to the General Allotment Act. The main reason is because as native Anishinaabe indigenous people of North America, or right here in Anishinaabe territory, our people back then could not comprehend land ownership. They didn't know what it meant, because we sincerely believed, we believe that today, that the land owns us. And back then, the Creator created everything for all people, and that's why they just could not comprehend, well, I own this, you own that. Realty, they felt. They couldn't understand what they meant by that. So therefore, they kept meeting, and finally they told the federal government, no, we do not want allotment. We all own this land in common, all tribal members, all the animals, the creation here on Anishinaabe territory, which you guys call Red Lake Band of Chippewa Indians. We all own this together. Not one person owns it individually. So that's the way we want to keep it, and that's how we were able to maintain our grasp on what we have today. Well, we have over 800,000 acres of land. 2/3 of it is water, and that includes the lake right here, 27 miles by 10 miles wide, plus 2/3 of Upper Red Lake belongs to Red Lake Nation. You will see no non-members out there on this water, because we do not allow non-members to enter our water. They can go to these little lakes back here and we let them fish back there, but not on this. And we just have control of our land. You know, that's the way it should be. And that's because of those chiefs, and that's what we're celebrating. The message that I would like to give is to our young people, you know, that our young native Anishinaabe here, not only in Red Lake, but wherever, you know, this history that we have, you know, that's ours, you know, to carry that on.
For more information about Native Report or the stories we've covered, look for us at nativereport.org and Facebook. Thank you for spending time with us here on Native Report. I'm Stacey Thunder.
Stacey Thunder is Ojibwe from the Red Lake and Lakota Ray Nations and is the Legislative Counsel for the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe. Professor Tad Johnson is the Director of the Master of Tribal Administration and Governance program at the University of Minnesota Duluth and is an enrolled member of the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa. Production of Native Report is made possible by grants from the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux Community and the Blandin Foundation.